November 20th, 1943. Batio Island, Tarawa Atoll. At the break of dawn, the first light crept over what would soon become the bloodiest stretch of sand in Marine Corps history. Near the shattered remains of Red Beach 2, I crouched beside my M1919A4 Browning machine gun, checking the ammo belts one last time. The air-cooled Browning sat steady on its lightweight tripod, 250 rounds of .30-06 Springfield ready to feed through. Around me, other Marine gunners were doing the same, their hands black with coral dust and gun oil, the air thick with smoke and tension. The ground itself seemed to hum beneath us. Then, through the haze of the morning, came a sound I'll never forget, the kind that crawls into your bones and stays there. It was the Japanese, hundreds of them, charging in a desperate counterattack. Their Type 92 heavy machine guns hammered out that slow, chattering rhythm that had earned them the grim nickname, Woodpecker. I could see their crews struggling under the weight of those beasts, 122 pounds apiece, feeding in 30-round metal strips as fast as they could. Meanwhile, our Brownings unleashed steady, punishing streams of fire without a pause. What happened next would prove beyond any doubt just how far ahead American automatic weapons doctrine had come, and why the M1919 Browning became the backbone of our firepower, while Japan's Type 92 fell short in the brutal reality of modern war. The M1919 had made its way into the Pacific as a product of experience and relentless engineering. Designed by the legendary John Moses Browning, it was an air-cooled evolution of his earlier M1917 water-cooled machine gun, a testament to American industrial might and practicality. It fired the powerful .30-06 Springfield cartridge at a rate of 400 to 600 rounds a minute, feeding from a 250-round cloth belt. Simple math, really, but devastating in effect. Each round sent a 150-grain bullet screaming out of the 24-inch barrel at about 2,800 feet per second, capable of tearing through targets over 1,500 yards away. The M1919A4 wasn't built for elegance. It was built to work. At 31 pounds for the gun and 14 more for the tripod, the whole setup came in at about 45 pounds, light enough for a two-man crew to carry and set up wherever needed. Some critics said its loose tolerances hurt accuracy, but out here in the grit and chaos of war, that looseness meant reliability. It kept firing even when clogged with sand, caked in mud, or fouled with carbon. The recoil-operated belt-fed system was simple enough that even a kid fresh out of boot camp could learn it fast, yet tough enough to keep spitting rounds for hours without failing. By 1944, America's factories had churned out nearly 390,000 of these machine guns in different versions. The production was spread across several companies. General Motors' Saginaw steering gear division alone turned out over 200,000 of them, while Buffalo Arms and Rock Island Arsenal added tens of thousands more. That massive output meant that no matter where we fought, Marines had the same dependable weapon by their side. In the Corps, the M1919A4s were issued at the company level, 2 guns to each weapons platoon, and by 1945, entire Marine divisions were bristling with them. Overlapping fields of fire from hundreds of Brownings created a wall of lead no infantry assault could break through. Facing us were the Japanese with their Type 92 heavy machine guns, weapons named for the Japanese imperial year 2592, which lined up with 1932 on our calendar. They were based on an old French Hotchkiss design, Japan's attempt to modernize its firepower. The Type 92 was gas-operated and air-cooled, firing the 7.758mm semi-rimmed cartridge from those short 30-round metal strips. On paper, it packed a decent punch, a heavier bullet than their earlier guns. But in practice, its flaws were deadly. It fired at around 450 rounds per minute, but that slow feed system, those tiny strips, crippled its effectiveness when the pressure was on. The Japanese Type 92 just couldn't keep up when it came to sustained fire. Sure, the 7.7mm cartridge had better ballistics than their older 6.5mm rounds, but the feeding system killed its potential. Those crews spent more time swapping out those short 30-round strips than actually shooting. The whole setup was a burden. The gun and tripod together weighed about 122 pounds, a whopping 77 pounds heavier than our M1919A4 with its tripod. That extra weight came from what I can only call over-engineering, built too precisely, too delicately, for the dirty, brutal chaos of combat. Its biggest flaw, though, was the ammunition oiling system. Each Type 92 had a built-in oil pump that coated every cartridge as it fed into the chamber. On paper, that sounded smart. The oil was supposed to help with extraction since the design lacked a proper mechanical extractor. But out here in the Pacific, surrounded by sand, mud, and grime, that oil just turned into a magnet for debris. Before long, the guns would jam tight, sometimes failing completely right when their crews needed them most. Those perfectly fitted parts might have looked impressive back in a Tokyo factory or a demonstration range. But in combat, they were a nightmare. The tight tolerances meant that even the tiniest bit of sand could stop the gun cold. Meanwhile, our Brownings, with their looser, more forgiving tolerances, kept firing even when they were filthy. The feed system was another headache. Those 30-round metal strips bent easily and broke if handled roughly, which was almost unavoidable in the middle of a fight. Every time a strip ran out, the gunners had to reload, precious seconds lost while their weapons sat silent. We, on the other hand, could connect multiple cloth belts on the M1919, feeding 500 rounds or more in one go. That kind of continuous fire could make the difference between holding the line and getting overrun. Even the sights on the Type 92 were awkward, offset to the right instead of centered, which threw off aim and made training more complicated. Small thing maybe, but when seconds count, that kind of design choice matters. From 1932 to 1945, Japan produced roughly 45,000 Type 92 heavy machine guns. They were built by Tokyo Gas and Electric, Hino Motors, and Hitachi, companies that took almost obsessive care with precision. The problem was, that kind of craftsmanship belonged in a peacetime workshop, not a wartime factory. Each gun required so much hand-fitting that production was slow and expensive. Meanwhile, back home, America was turning out nearly 390,000 M1919s during the war, almost 9 times Japan's total output. That difference told the real story. It wasn't just about better weapons, it was about industrial muscle. Our manufacturing approach was completely different. We treated gun production the same way we built cars. Companies like General Motors' Saginaw Steering Gear Division applied assembly line methods straight from the auto industry, cranking out guns faster than anyone thought possible. And every part was standardized. You could take a Browning made by Buffalo Arms and swap parts with one from Rock Island or Saginaw without a hitch. The Japanese didn't have that luxury. Each Type 92 was practically handmade, and replacement parts often had to be custom-fitted. What worked for one gun might not fit another at all. By 1944, our factories were producing more M1919s in a single month than Japan could make Type 92s in an entire year. That says everything about why we won. The difference between fighting with machines made by craftsmen and fighting with machines built by an industrial powerhouse. At Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, the night of October 24th through the 25th, 1942, we learned firsthand just how much reliable automatic weapons could decide a battle. That night, Sergeant John Basilone earned his Medal of Honor manning the old M1917 water-cooled Brownings. But all around the Marine perimeter, crews armed with the newer air-cooled M1919A4s showed the other side of the equation: mobility. When the Japanese Sendai Division came at us in wave after wave, those of us manning the lighter Brownings could move fast. We shifted positions wherever the line started to buckle, setting up on the fly to plug gaps before the enemy could exploit them. The M1917s, big and heavy as they were, stayed put. Their water jackets and tripods made them more like fixed artillery than field guns. But the M1919 crews? We were the quick reaction force. Private First Class Mitchell Page, who also earned his Medal of Honor that same night, said it best later on. The air-cooled 30s were our mobile reserve, When the Japs broke through, we could grab the gun and tripod and run to plug the gap. That was exactly how it felt, fast, flexible, and always in the thick of it. A year later, at Tarawa in November 1943, those same traits made all the difference again. During the amphibious landings, most of our guns and gear were soaked with salt water before we even hit the beach. But the M1919s still came alive without hesitation. Corporal James Russell of the 2nd Marine Division was one of the many who proved it. He took his M1919A4 straight through coral and shell fire, wiping out multiple Japanese positions by hand-carrying the gun forward, setting up and firing again and again. "The gun never quit," he said afterward. "We'd dump water from our canteens on the barrel to cool it, wipe sand off the belts, and just keep firing. We went through 10 boxes of ammo, about 2,500 rounds, and never had a stoppage." That kind of dependability made the difference between surviving and not. Meanwhile, the Japanese Type 92s defending Betio kept locking up, their oiling systems mixing with coral dust and turning into mud inside the chambers. Their guns were choking while ours just kept talking. Then came Saipan, in June and July of 1944, maybe the most brutal proof of all. During the massive Banzai charge on July 7th, more than 4,000 Japanese soldiers came storming toward our lines. The M1919 crews of the 27th Infantry Division were ready. We had overlapping fields of fire that crossed like a web, turning that charge into pure carnage. Sergeant Thomas Baker's crew, for instance, fired nearly non-stop for 6 hours straight, chewing through case after case of ammunition. His assistant gunner, Carl Morrison, later said, "We had spare barrels ready. When one got too hot, we'd swap it in 10 seconds and keep shooting. The Japs just kept coming, and we just kept killing them. Our gun alone must have dropped 200 of them." On Peleliu in September 1944, the M1919's reputation for reliability became legend. The heat was brutal, 115 degrees in the shade, and even standing still felt like punishment. The Japanese Type 92s out there couldn't handle it. Their tightly fitted metal parts would expand in the heat and seize up. But our Brownings kept running. Corporal Sterling Mace remembered it clearly. The woodpeckers would fire a strip or two, then go silent, jammed again. Our 30s just kept hammering away. We knew we had fire superiority, and that gave us the confidence to keep moving forward. By February 1945, in the Battle for Manila, the fight had shifted to the cities. Close quarters, building-to-building combat. There, mobility was everything. Our M1919 crews could move fast, lugging the 45-pound system from window to window, street to street, laying down fire and then shifting positions before enemy mortars could lock onto us. The two-man teams could carry everything they needed and stay light on their feet. The Japanese, weighed down by their 122-pound Type 92s and mounts, didn't have that option. Once they set up, they were basically anchored. Lieutenant Colonel John Sisson summed it up perfectly later. In city fighting, the ability to shoot and move was everything. Our machine gun teams could get into position, fire a belt, and relocate before Japanese mortars could target them. The enemy's Type 92s were death traps, too heavy to move, too easy to hit. All of this came from lessons that started back in World War I. The M1919's design was born from experience, and from American innovation between the wars. The original M1917 water-cooled Browning had already proven itself in France, but the Army knew the future of warfare would be faster, more mobile, and more mechanized. In 1919, John Browning reworked his design, trading water cooling for air cooling and creating a weapon that could be mounted just about anywhere, on a jeep, a tank, a plane, or right in an infantryman's hands. The Ordnance Department spent years refining it, testing it, improving it bit by bit. Every tweak, every upgrade came from one simple philosophy: test it hard, listen to the guys who use it, and never stop improving. Between 1919 and 1936, the Browning M1919 went through years of fine-tuning before the A4 model finally took shape. Dozens of changes were made during that time, all based on real troop trials and battlefield feedback, not some engineer's guesswork. The barrel got stronger, the feed mechanism was simplified, and the tripod was redesigned to sit lower and weigh less. All practical improvements born from the hard lessons of real combat. The 3006 Springfield cartridge, standardized way back in 1906, had already proven itself after decades of use. It struck the perfect balance between power, range, and control. It was the kind of round soldiers could trust, whether they were firing from a foxhole or a jeep-mounted gun. On the other side of the world, though, the Japanese took a different approach. Their Type 92 heavy machine gun was meant to be an improvement over older designs, but it ended up being a step backward in actual combat. Japan had based it on the old French Hotchkiss gun they'd licensed back in 1905 during the Russo-Japanese War. They tried to refine it, make it smoother, more precise, but every improvement seemed to make it less reliable in real fighting. Part of the problem was experience. The Japanese army had mostly fought in China, against forces that were poorly armed and lightly trained. In that kind of fight, the Type 92's ability to fire accurate single shots or short bursts seemed good enough. They never faced an enemy like the U.S. Marines, where overwhelming firepower decided who lived and who didn't. They just didn't grasp how much sheer volume of fire mattered in modern warfare. And then there was their obsession with precision craftsmanship. That came straight out of samurai tradition, valuing perfect workmanship over mass production. Every Type 92 was basically hand-built, its parts carefully fitted together by skilled craftsmen. That was fine for making rifles or swords, but it was a disaster when you needed tens of thousands of machine guns to fight a world war. You can't hand-fit victory one gun at a time. Their engineers even added an oil pump system to make up for a design flaw: the lack of a proper extraction mechanism in the original Hotchkiss pattern. The idea was to lubricate the cartridges for easier feeding, but in the jungle, it backfired horribly. The oil turned into a sticky paste when it mixed with dirt, humidity, and plant matter. The result? Guns that jammed constantly. It was a clever fix on paper and a fatal flaw in practice. As the war dragged on, even the Japanese began to realize how outgunned they were. American firepower wasn't just stronger. It was relentless. Captured documents from the island-hopping campaign showed their growing frustration. One diary found on Saipan read, "The enemy's machine guns fire continuously without pause. Our Type 92s must stop to reload every 30 rounds, while the Americans seem to have endless ammunition. We cannot advance through their fire. One American gun does the work of 5 of ours." Another report from Guadalcanal put it even more bluntly. "Enemy automatic weapons create a solid wall of bullets. Our woodpecker cannot compete with their sustained fire. They have removed the human element from killing. It is pure machinery." That kind of realization wasn't just tactical. It was psychological. The constant, unbroken roar of our M1919s terrified them. They started calling American strongpoints the lawnmower because of how efficiently our guns cut down their charges. Before some of their attacks even began, the sound of our Brownings, that fast mechanical chatter, would break their spirit. Their own Type 92s, with their slower, talking rhythm, couldn't match the intensity. A captured Japanese training manual from 1944 even admitted it outright. The enemy's superior firepower, especially their machine guns, must be neutralized through night infiltration and close combat, where their advantage is reduced. In other words, they knew they couldn't win in a stand-up fight. Lieutenant Hiroaki Samishima, who was captured later on Luzon, described the situation perfectly when he was interrogated. "We knew our machine gun was inferior," he said. "The oil pump constantly failed. In jungle humidity, the oil became like glue, mixing with plant matter and dirt. We spent more time cleaning than firing. The feed strips bent easily and only held 30 rounds. By the time we reloaded, half our squad was dead. We called the American guns Hitler's zipper because of the sound. Like a zipper opening, but much more terrible. Even after the war, Japanese military documents recovered from Kure Naval Base admitted the truth plainly. The Type 92 heavy machine gun has proven inadequate against American forces. Their M1919 series weapons achieve fire superiority in every engagement. Recommendations for improvement cannot be implemented due to production limitations. Units must rely on courage to overcome mechanical inferiority. Courage over machinery. That was their final fallback. But courage alone couldn't stop the relentless firepower of the Browning. If there was one thing that really set us apart from the Japanese during the war, it was consistency, especially when it came to our M1919 production. American factories managed to crank out more and more guns every month without sacrificing quality. What started as hundreds of units early on turned into thousands by the middle of the war. Yet the standards never slipped. No matter where the guns came from, Saginaw, Buffalo Arms, or Rock Island Arsenal, the parts were completely interchangeable. That kind of standardization was gold out in the field. If a firing pin broke or a feed pal bent, we could fix it on the spot using pieces from another gun, or even strip parts off one that was too damaged to fire. It meant no M1919 stayed silent for long. Quality control stayed tight too. Every factory followed strict specifications and used statistical sampling to make sure no defective parts slipped through. Oddly enough, the methods that made mass production possible, simplified designs, wider tolerances, fewer unnecessary parts, actually made the M1919 more reliable, not less. By cutting out complexity, the gun just worked better. The production lines themselves ran with almost military precision. At Saginaw's plant, for example, many of the workers had originally built steering columns for cars. They were retrained to make machine guns, applying the same assembly line discipline that kept Detroit running. Specialized tools, conveyor systems, division of labor. It was the car industry turned into a war machine. Each worker performed one operation again and again, perfecting their motion until it was second nature. That's how you build 10,000 M1919s a month, which Saginaw was doing by 1943. More in a single month than Japan managed to produce Type 92s in an entire year. Meanwhile, the Japanese factories were going in the opposite direction. The early Type 92s made by Tokyo Gas and Electric were beautiful, perfectly blued, tightly fitted, and almost too well made. You could tell they'd been built by craftsmen, not machinists. But by 1944, the war had stripped Japan of materials, manpower, and time. The guns rolling off the line looked rough. Machining marks everywhere, cheap sights, weak metals. They started substituting inferior materials just to keep production going. Late war Type 92s were fragile things. Captured examples from 1945 showed all sorts of cut corners. Cast steel replaced with brittle cast iron. Wooden handles swapped in where metal used to be, and simplified feed guides that jammed constantly. Even the oil pump, already a headache, became worse. With less precision in manufacturing, the pumps either flooded the action with oil or starved it completely. Too much, and the gun would choke on mud and debris. Too little, and the rounds would stick and tear in the chamber. By the last year of the war, American intelligence was reporting that captured Type 92s were practically useless unless completely rebuilt. The Japanese knew it too. Their own inspectors were rejecting more and more of the new guns coming off the line. But with the war going against them, even the bad ones got shipped out to the front. And while Japan struggled to make a few dozen serviceable guns, the United States was drowning in ammunition. We were producing .30-06 rounds in unbelievable numbers, millions upon millions, all perfectly standardized. It didn't matter whether they came from Denver, St. Louis, Salt Lake City, or any of the other plants across the country. Every single cartridge chambered and fired exactly the same in any M1919 we carried. In the Pacific, we got our ammo in moisture-proof metal containers, another small but vital detail. Those sealed boxes kept our rounds clean and dry, even in the damp tropical heat. Meanwhile, Japanese ammunition often corroded before it ever reached the front lines. By 1944, our factories were running around the clock, turning out bullets faster than we could shoot them, and believe me, we shot plenty. We were producing over 10 billion rounds every year, more than enough to keep every machine gun in the service firing non-stop if needed. The pace of innovation didn't slow down either. Both the weapon itself and its ammunition kept evolving throughout the war. The improved armor-piercing M2 rounds could punch right through Japanese bunkers and even take down aircraft. For night operations, we had a variety of tracer rounds, each designed for a specific purpose. The standard red tracers made it easy to mark targets, while dim tracers were used when we didn't want to give away our position. Then there were the delayed tracers, which stayed invisible until about 100 yards out, so the enemy couldn't trace the shots back to the gunner. Incendiary rounds proved devastating against Japanese planes and fuel dumps. Then came the specialized API rounds, armor-piercing incendiary, which not only cut through armor but also set their targets ablaze. By late 1943, the M1919A6 variant rolled out. It had a shoulder stock, a carrying handle, and a bipod, which made it easier to move around. Sure, it was still heavier than what you'd want in a true light machine gun, around 32 pounds without the tripod, but it gave us a lot more flexibility in the field. Out in the Pacific, Marine units started making their own field mods. One of the most famous was the Basilone bale, a handle made of wire and wood that could be attached to a hot barrel when we needed to relocate fast. John Basilone himself came up with it after his experience on Guadalcanal, and eventually it became standard issue. Some Marines even tried rigging special mounts that allowed them to fire the M1919s from the hip while advancing, but that idea didn't really pan out in combat. What worked better were the makeshift anti-aircraft mounts, cobbled together from salvaged materials, that let us fire on low-flying Japanese planes. Tank crews also got creative, welding extra M1919s to their vehicles for more firepower against enemy infantry. The beauty of the gun's design was its simplicity. You could make these modifications with just basic tools and a little know-how. Meanwhile, Japan was having a much harder time keeping up. Their Type 92 machine gun used a special semi-rimmed 7.7mm cartridge that required very precise manufacturing. As American subs cut off their shipping routes and B-29s leveled their factories, producing enough ammo became almost impossible. To make matters worse, they had at least 4 slightly different, non-interchangeable versions of the 7.7mm round, which turned their logistics into a nightmare. The 30-round feed strips were flimsy and often got damaged. In the humid Pacific air, they'd rust together, and rough handling could bend them beyond use. The M1919's cloth belts, by contrast, could be linked endlessly and took a beating without failing. Each Type 92 strip, though, was a weak link waiting to break. Japan's lack of innovation showed. The Type 92s used at Guadalcanal in 1942 were practically identical to those still being fired in the last battles of 1945. They never fixed the oil pump issues, the feed strip limitations, or the weapon's excessive weight. Their factories were already struggling just to meet demand, so redesigns that required retooling weren't even on the table. Even simple improvements, like drilling drain holes for water buildup or enlarging trigger guards for gloved hands, were ignored. Back home, American machine gun crews got thorough training before being shipped out. The M1919 was brilliantly simple. To fire it, you just pulled the bolt handle back twice, fed the belt from the left, and squeezed the trigger. Swapping out a hot barrel took only seconds with an asbestos mitt, though you had to open the top cover first, but compared to other guns of the time, it was a breeze. Our doctrine focused on heavy, reliable fire and mechanical simplicity. Crews worked in pairs or small teams, one man on the gun, another managing ammo and cooling. Training was all about practical skill, not ceremony. We drilled until clearing jams became muscle memory. We learned to tell what kind of malfunction had happened just by the sound of the gun. Estimating range, adjusting fire patterns, and manipulating elevation and traverse. It all became second nature. But the most important lesson we learned was mobility. Shoot, then move. Fire short bursts. Change position before the enemy's mortars could zero in. The M1919's 45-pound weight made that possible. We could grab the gun and tripod and be sprinting to a new spot in seconds. Coordination was another key to success. Machine guns were set up in pairs or clusters with overlapping fields of fire, creating deadly kill zones no enemy could cross. Each position covered the others, so if one gun jammed or went down, another was ready to keep the fire rolling. Whenever one gun crew had to swap out a barrel, the others would ramp up their rate of fire to cover them. That kind of teamwork made a huge difference. It multiplied the effectiveness of every machine gun on the line. The Japanese Type 92 crews, on the other hand, had a much tougher time just keeping their guns running. Their oil pump had to be adjusted perfectly depending on the temperature and humidity. Too much oil in cold weather would thicken up and jam the works, while too little in the heat would cause the gun to seize. Every 30-round feed strip had to be loaded with care so the lips wouldn't bend. Even the sights were a headache, complicated and needing constant calibration, especially since different ammunition types required different settings. Japanese doctrine was built around precision, not volume. Type 92 gunners were trained to fire short, accurate bursts at specific targets rather than laying down steady, suppressive fire. In theory, it made sense. They had limited ammo, and reloading was slow, but in practice, that approach turned deadly against us. See, the Japanese thought we fought with human waves, but they were dead wrong. We didn't throw bodies at them. We threw firepower. While a Japanese Type 92 crew carefully lined up a single shot on one Marine, 3 or 4 of our M1919s would be hammering their entire position, tearing it apart with overlapping bursts. The M1919 earned a reputation for reliability that bordered on legendary among those of us who fought in the Pacific. We heard stories, and I saw a few myself, of guns that kept firing even after being buried in sand, dunked in seawater, or coated in volcanic ash on Iwo Jima. What some critics back home called loose tolerances, meaning the parts weren't tightly fitted, turned out to be a blessing. That bit of give allowed the gun to keep working even when it was full of grime and debris, which was exactly what we needed in those miserable island conditions. I remember hearing about guns that fired almost non-stop for hours. The crews would dump water from their canteens onto the barrels just to keep them from glowing red hot. One story out of Okinawa still gets told. An M1919 took a direct hit from a Japanese shell and was blasted off a cliff, falling nearly 30 feet onto rocks below. The crew climbed down, pulled it out, replaced the bent tripod, and got it firing again before the day was out. Another time on Guam, a machine gun was found in a swamp after being submerged for 3 days. The men cleaned it up, added a little oil, and sure enough, it ran perfectly. Those stories weren't just campfire tales, they were backed up by after-action reports. They gave us confidence, knowing our guns could take punishment and still deliver. The reason behind that reliability was the M1919's simplicity. It had only a few main components: the bolt, barrel, and feed mechanism, and not much else to go wrong. Since it operated on recoil, as long as it was getting ammo, it would keep cycling. Even old beat-up guns with worn parts or bad headspace would still fire, though maybe not as accurately. Field maintenance was straightforward too. Just clean it up and oil it with whatever was on hand. We used motor oil, cooking oil, even coconut oil when supplies ran low, and the gun didn't care. It just kept working. The Japanese Type 92 was another story entirely. It earned a reputation for jamming, and we learned to listen for that sudden silence. The moment a Type 92 stopped firing, we knew it had probably jammed. And that was our cue to move up or shift position. Ironically, the same oiling system that was supposed to make it more reliable turned out to be its worst flaw. In the wet jungles of Guadalcanal and New Guinea, the oil mixed with moisture, dirt, and bits of vegetation, turning into a sticky paste that froze the mechanism solid. Out on the coral atolls, places like Tarawa and Peleliu, the fine sand got into everything, blending with the oil to make a gritty, abrasive mess that chewed up the gun's carefully machined parts. Veterans who examined captured Type 92s often said, Captured Type 92s were practically useless unless they were given constant, careful maintenance. Even when they were cleaned and serviced properly, they still needed non-stop attention just to keep them running. The feed strips rusted fast in the Pacific's heavy humidity, often fusing together and refusing to feed at all. The oil pump, meant to keep the gun lubricated, would clog with grit and debris, forcing crews to take the whole thing apart to clear it. On top of that, the gun's precisely fitted parts had no tolerance for heat. Under the blistering island sun, they'd expand just enough to seize solid. American intelligence eventually calculated that the Type 92 needed about 5 times more maintenance than our M1919 just to stay operational. That difference became painfully clear during the Battle of Okinawa, the bloodiest and final major clash of the Pacific War. By then, from April through June of 1945, our forces had 3 hard years of experience fighting across the islands. We'd refined our machine gun tactics down to an art. M1919 crews operated with clockwork precision, overlapping their fields of fire so tightly that any Japanese attack was practically suicidal. The fighting on Okinawa was relentless. Machine guns fired almost around the clock for days, testing both the endurance of the men and the reliability of their weapons. When the Japanese launched their massive counterattack on May 4, 1945, it turned into one of the most intense human wave assaults we'd ever faced. The M1919s roared without pause. Crews from the 96th Infantry Division fired continuously for over 12 hours. One section, led by Staff Sergeant Buford Anderson, burned through 30,000 rounds in a single night, going through 6 spare barrels, but not once did the gun jam. "We just kept feeding belts and swapping barrels," Anderson later said. "The gun never quit. The bodies piled up so high in front of us, they blocked our line of sight. We had to fire right through them." Meanwhile, the Japanese Type 92 crews fought with incredible courage, but their weapons simply couldn't keep up. Every burst drained their 30-round strips in seconds, forcing them to reload constantly under heavy return fire. The lack of sustained firepower meant that our troops could push forward during those brief lulls when the Japanese were fumbling to reload. Great. Here's the next chunk rewritten in the same plain-spoken first-person voice. I kept every fact and figure intact, while smoothing the flow and adding a little color so it reads naturally for an AI narration. When a Type 92 did manage to score a hit, the effect on us was small compared to the sheer, overwhelming torrents of fire from our M1919s that could clear a whole area of life in seconds. The cave fighting on Okinawa really showed off another one of the M1919's strengths. Because the gun was portable enough for infantry and Marines to carry into cave complexes, we could bring real firepower into those tight, claustrophobic spaces. The Japanese 122-pound Type 92, by contrast, was basically useless inside those caves. Too heavy and too ungainly to move. American after-action reports found Type 92s abandoned in caves all over the island, their crews often trapped because the guns couldn't be displaced when the position was overrun. You'd find jammed mechanisms and broken feed strips scattered around, the last desperate evidence of a crew's final moments. One statistic from Okinawa summed it up. We captured more than 200 Type 92 machine guns, and only 12 of them were actually in working order. The rest had been left behind because they broke, were destroyed by their crews to keep them from falling into our hands, or were simply worn out beyond repair. By contrast, M1919s that had seen action since Guadalcanal were still running reliably 3 years later. At war's end, the production gap made the strategic picture crystal clear. The United States made nearly 390,000 M1919s across all variants, while Japan managed barely 45,000 Type 92s. That's almost a 9-to-1 advantage in automatic weapons, and that difference shaped everything in the Pacific. We could afford to waste rounds, to pour ammunition into fields and ridgelines, because our supply lines could sustain it. The Japanese couldn't. They had to conserve every cartridge because resupply was getting harder and harder. The M1919 didn't disappear with World War II. It stayed in service through Korea, Vietnam, and a host of other conflicts. Allied countries kept using it into the 1990s, and some were even rechambered to 7.62 Aussies 51mm NATO and soldiered on for years. The gun's belt feed system and quick change barrel concept became standard features for later designs. The M60 that eventually replaced the M1919 borrowed a lot of Browning's ideas, proof that his basic concept was solid. Still, we respected the bravery of the Type 92 crews. Those men fought hard with what they had. Captured Type 92s became prized war trophies, though most Americans who took them home didn't realize how inferior they were to our guns. After the war, veterans would bring captured Type 92s to Bond rallies and demonstrations, showing off the awkward feed strips and complicated internals to amazed crowds and making a point about American technical superiority. Ironically, many of the Type 92s that became collector's items after the war survive in better shape today than they ever did in combat, because private owners have the time and patience to give those guns the constant care they demanded. Post-war ordnance tests at Aberdeen Proving Ground laid bare the Type 92's flaws. Even when maintained perfectly under ideal conditions, it couldn't match the M1919's sustained rate of fire. The oil pump lubrication system was fundamentally unsuitable for combat service. The feed strips were obsolete, and the excessive weight robbed the weapon of tactical flexibility. The report bluntly concluded that the Type 92 was a peacetime design, not fit for the realities of modern warfare. The contrast between the two guns was more than engineering. It reflected two very different national approaches. American industry and doctrine emphasized mass production, standardization, and overwhelming firepower. The M1919 was built so it could be manufactured in automobile plants, maintained by green hands, and issued in huge numbers, quantity with acceptable quality rather than perfect weapons in too small batches. Our factories already were the world's biggest, and they shifted gears to churn out weapons using the same workers, tools, and production methods that had made cars. That flexibility let us ramp production up fast and keep it going. Standardized, interchangeable parts simplified logistics. Any part fit any gun, and any ammunition would work in any weapon. That kind of uniformity multiplied our combat power by keeping guns in the fight and supplies flowing where they were needed. Japan's whole approach to warfare came from a tradition that valued the skill of the individual warrior more than the strength of an industrial machine. You could see that mindset built right into the Type 92. Its careful precision and obsession with accuracy over raw firepower echoed old samurai ideals. Noble, maybe, but completely out of place in an age of mechanized war. That complex oiling system and those fragile feed strips were proof that Japanese engineers hadn't fully grasped the realities of modern battle. Reliability mattered far more than precision or craftsmanship when you were knee-deep in mud, sand, and chaos. The gun's heavy weight and complicated design showed a fundamental misunderstanding of what the battlefield demanded: mobility and sustained fire, not delicate perfection. This difference in philosophy went far beyond mechanics. It shaped the psychology of the entire war in the Pacific. We knew our weapons were better. That confidence seeped into everything we did. Marines and soldiers alike stood their ground against banzai charges, absolutely sure their M1919s would hold the line. We could advance aggressively because we trusted those guns to keep Japanese defenders pinned down. That confidence became a cycle. Our firepower made our aggressive tactics work, and every victory reinforced the doctrine that sheer fire was the key to success. The Japanese, on the other hand, knew their Type 92s couldn't compete with the volume of fire we could throw at them. That realization pushed them toward increasingly desperate measures. The infamous banzai charges that came later in the war weren't just acts of blind fanaticism. They were born from desperation. When you can't outshoot the enemy, the only thing left is to try to close the distance, to get within hand-to-hand range where his machine guns can't dominate you. But that kind of fighting was suicide against American firepower, and it cost the Japanese thousands upon thousands of lives. The deeper lesson wasn't just about weapons, it was about industry itself. America's ability to mass-produce standardized equipment meant every part of our war effort was scalable. Ammunition, spare parts, training manuals, you name it, we could make it endlessly and keep it coming. Japan's more artisan way of building things meant every gun, every component was a little bit different. That meant no easy replacements, no simple logistics, and a constant struggle to keep their forces supplied. The system just couldn't sustain itself. I'll never forget the morning of July 7th, 1944, on Saipan, where all these lessons came crashing together. The Japanese launched massive charges against our positions, and once again they ran straight into a wall of American machine gun fire. By then, the outcome wasn't in question. Our M1919s were laying down 400 to 600 rounds a minute from long, 250-round belts, while the Japanese Type 92s struggled to keep up with their 30-round feed strips, even at 450 rounds per minute. The math was brutal and undeniable. For every burst they managed, we were sending 10 times the lead downrange. A single M1919 could fire for a full minute without stopping, throwing hundreds of bullets into the fight. A Type 92, on the other hand, had to reload 20 times to match that volume, and every reload took precious seconds under fire. Multiply that difference across hundreds of battles, and it became clear why we dominated the Pacific. Every Marine rifle company had machine guns powerful enough to lock down an entire battlefield. Every Army battalion could create kill zones that no Japanese force could break through. And through it all, the M1919 never failed us. Whether it was in choking jungle humidity, blinding coral dust, or thick volcanic ash, it just kept firing. It didn't matter if it was volcanic ash, monsoon rain, or the choking humidity of the jungle. Our M1919s just kept firing. The Japanese couldn't say the same. Their Type 92s were unreliable enough that no soldier could fully trust them when it mattered most. And that uncertainty ate away at morale. The production numbers alone tell the rest of the story. Roughly 390,000 M1919s to just 45,000 Type 92s. That wasn't just a statistic, it was the foundation of overwhelming superiority. We didn't just have more guns. We had guns that worked better, lasted longer, and could be fed endlessly with ammo, parts, and trained crews. The American advantage compounded on itself. More weapons firing more reliably for longer stretches, backed by limitless ammunition. It was a level of firepower that no amount of bravery could overcome. The M1919's success was living proof of both John Moses Browning's genius and America's industrial strength. He had designed a gun that married solid engineering with the realities of mass production. It wasn't elegant for its own sake. It was efficient, practical, and deadly. The .30-06 cartridge, fired at 400 to 600 rounds per minute through that simple, rugged mechanism, outclassed Japan's more delicate, precision-engineered Type 92 at every level. In the end, it was the ability to sustain fire, to make killing an industrial process, that determined victory in the Pacific. For Japan, the Type 92 became a symbol of a larger problem, trying to fight a modern industrial war with weapons built in an old-world, artisan way. Its weight, complexity, and constant mechanical issues were the symptoms of a military that hadn't fully grasped what modern warfare required. That same attention to fine craftsmanship, admirable in peacetime, turned into a fatal weakness on the battlefield. Japan's focus on marksmanship and precision couldn't compete with America's doctrine of volume and suppression, where the goal wasn't one perfect shot, but a storm of lead that buried the enemy before he could react. The Pacific War proved a hard truth. In modern combat, it's not perfection that wins. It's sustained, reliable firepower. Our forces, armed with M1919 Brownings, could throw up literal walls of lead that no amount of courage could break through. Japanese troops with their Type 92s were simply outgunned. Their carefully aimed bursts couldn't compete with the relentless, belt-fed streams pouring from our guns. The math said it all. Our M1919s fired 400 to 600 rounds a minute from long belts, while the Type 92 could only manage 450 rounds per minute. And from tiny 30-round strips. The result was brutal. The Japanese infantry charges that once worked in China against poorly equipped armies turned suicidal against us. Thousands of soldiers died trying to charge across kill zones dominated by American machine guns, their courage spent against an industrial killing system they could never hope to match. In the end, the contrast between the M1919 and the Type 92 wasn't just about two weapons. It was about two worlds colliding. The M1919 stood for American industry, practical design, and a clear understanding of what modern war demanded. It was the victory of the good enough over the perfect, the practical over the theoretical, the industrial over the handcrafted. The Type 92, for all its careful construction, represented the limits of a nation still fighting yesterday's war, built with methods meant for an earlier time, and employed with tactics that belonged to another century. It simply couldn't compete. When American machine guns opened up on those charging Japanese infantrymen, the result had already been decided. Not in that moment, but years earlier, on assembly lines thousands of miles away. By the time the M1919 Browning dominated the battlefields of the Pacific, it had already won the war of production. It proved itself one of the most successful military weapons in history, while the Type 92 became a haunting reminder of Japan's struggle to fight a modern war with outdated ideas. In the end, Japan's failure to keep pace with America's industrial might sealed its fate. The Pacific War wasn't decided by courage. Both sides had that in full measure. It was decided by who could build, supply, and sustain modern war. Victory came down to the nation that could mass-produce reliable weapons and keep them firing day after day, battle after battle. When you look at the numbers, they tell the story better than words ever could. Nearly 390,000 M1919s against just 45,000 Type 92s. That difference alone explains the outcome. The war in the Pacific was ultimately won not by bravery, but by production. By the simple, unrelenting power of American industry turning steel, sweat, and ingenuity into firepower that never ran dry.